Hello, everyone. Bill Wilson, Senior Editor of Supermarket News, with another edition of SN Off the Shelf. And today with me, I have Eric Fruits. He's a senior scholar at the International Center for Law and Economics, and he also co-authored a white paper titled Food Retail Competition, Antitrust Law, and the Kroger Albertsons Merger. So, Eric, welcome. Thanks for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. It's great to be here.
So I'm just going to be real general here with my first question. I mean, your white paper is basically saying, you know what, they've done everything right to get this merger passed. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, sure. To me, as an economist, I think it's a really interesting merger. Anyone who's been following antitrust over the past few years knows that a lot of the focus has been on big tech. And so, in some ways, the Kroger Albertsons merger is a little bit of a breath of fresh air because I think it's an important merger in a big sector of the U.S. economy that doesn't involve big tech, at least for the most part. And what's interesting, I think, also from an economic standpoint, is this is looking more and more like it is going to be one of the first grocery store mergers or supermarket mergers that's going to be challenged, probably in court, by the Federal Trade Commission ever since the late 1980s. With the Lucky acquisition, because since then, just about every supermarket merger in traditional supermarkets has gone through, that the Federal Trade Commission has allowed that merger to go through, usually with some sort of divestiture where the merging parties sell off their stores to try to resolve any sort of competitive concerns in different geographic areas. And so what's really interesting about this one right now is that the Federal Trade Commission has dropped some really big hints that they will challenge this merger, and the merging parties, particularly Kroger's CEO, has indicated that they are willing to fight this in court. So there's a very good chance that this case could end up in court, and that'd be the first time that something like that has happened in this type of supermarket merger since the late 1980s.
So, I mean, you mentioned the divestiture, which they're selling off a bunch of stores to C&S Wholesale Grocers, and that's a very big part of this merger being successful. Why then do you think the FTC is going to challenge this in court and go that far?
Well, one is that the FTC has an attitude that big is bad, and it's very hard to get around the fact that this is a very big merger. Depending on how you calculate it, the merged company would be anywhere from the third to the sixth largest supermarket or food and grocery retailer in the country. And we could get into that, why that may not be such a big deal. But the bottom line is the Federal Trade Commission sees that as being big, and big is bad. The other thing, too, is I think that the Federal Trade Commission has been a little bit affected by the Safeway Albertsons merger, where that involved a divestiture to Hagen's, and that has anyone who's in the supermarket industry knows the story that was more or less considered a disaster. And so the Federal Trade Commission doesn't like this merger because it's big, and they have indicated that they don't think that any sort of divestiture can solve the problems that they think there are with this merger. And so they haven't said anything explicitly, but they've dropped some really strong hints that they really intend to dig in and try to just block this outright.
So what do you say about Walmart then? They are the king of grocery. They have over 3,000 plus stores. Why is the FTC turning away from that when I mean, you said big, they don't like big. Well, Walmart is enormous.
Well, that's certainly one issue. And I think the obvious answer to that is that Walmart's not merging with anyone, so there's nothing for them to block. The other thing too is that Walmart, does a lot more than just food and groceries. But then again, I live in Portland where we have Fred Meyer stores owned by Kroger, and Fred Meyer stores are kind of like slightly smaller versions of Walmart, because you could get food, groceries, lawnmowers, and so the Fred Meyer stores are super centers, much like a Walmart is a super center. But again, I think the main reason why the FTC would be challenging this and not paying attention to Walmart right now is because Walmart hasn't proposed a merger, and I think that's just the way it is.
So we talked to a former FTC policy director, David Balto, about the merger, basically, and he thinks it's going to have a difficult time getting approval. Let me just talk about a couple things here. He thinks that the divestiture would have gone over better if it was, sold off to someone like Ahold Delhaize or another major supermarket chain that's what they do. Do you think that really matters, that they're going over and whoever they choose as their divestiture partner?
It could, but recall Hagen's was also a retail grocer. I think there's some things about CNS that put it in a unique situation that might be favorable. My understanding is that as CNS are wholesalers, and for a long time, Food Lion was one of their major customers. And then, if I recall correctly, Kroger bought Food Lion. And so CNS, because a lot of Kroger operations are vertically integrated, CNS lost a lot of that Food Lion work. And so CNS for a while has been looking to get into retail as a way to bolster its wholesale operations. And so my guess, and again, I have no inside information, but my guess is that CNS has seen this as a great opportunity for them to find an outlet for their wholesale operations into retail. They seem to be sufficiently capitalized. That was a big issue with Hagen, was that they were going into markets that they hadn't traditionally gone into before, that they weren't very well capitalized, and it seems that CNS seems to be in a much better situation. Now, you mentioned Ahold Delhaize. I think one of the issues that the FTC could conceivably have with that is that they have also, when Ahold Delhaize, when they were combining, that raised an issue at the FTC, and that resulted in spinoffs. That was an example of one of those mergers that the FTC raised an eyebrow. The parties came up with a divestiture plan, and then they divested the stores. And it's telling that you have David Balto, who is now pointing to that as a success, as being a potential acquirer of the Kroger Albertsons stores. What's interesting is I read an article by David Balto that he wrote in the early 2000s, and it to me it is fascinating because it was in many ways very prescient, because he identified two things. He identified the growth of wholesale clubs as being an issue that down the road, they said, these wholesale clubs, they're still kind of new, but they're starting to grow. They're starting to eat into food and grocery margins at supermarkets. They could be a competitive concern down the road. And again, he wrote this in 2000. And, I remember I lived in LA in the late 90s, early 2000s. And that's when you had these companies like Webvan and Home Grocer operating. And he said, gee, e-commerce can also be, a competitive issue down the road. Too early now in 2000, 2001, but, here we are now, 20, 21 years later. And we've argued in our paper that these warehouse clubs have now become key competitors to supermarkets, and e-commerce in some ways has too. I think e-commerce is going to be a big question. It's going to come up if this case gets litigated, because I don't think a lot of people have a good idea of how to deal with e-commerce. I think the warehouse clubs, there's a lot of information I think you can make a lot of really good arguments why warehouse clubs should be considered the relevant market, why warehouse clubs should be considered to be imposing competitive pressure on supermarkets. You could also conceivably argue the other side of that. That's going to be a factual issue that will be resolved in court. And to me, again, as an economist, that will be fascinating, because this, if it gets litigated, this will be the first test of a theory of whether or not warehouse clubs should be considered the relevant market along with supermarkets. If you go on to the e-commerce side, there's so many facets of e-commerce that I think a lot of people haven't thought through in terms of dealing with it in a merger space. You've got the obvious e-commerce such as Amazon. I know in my household, there's a lot of regular household goods that we used to buy at the supermarket that we now buy on Amazon. But then there's other parts of e-commerce that are kind of in a netherworld, right? You've got things like Instacart, where I use Instacart to purchase groceries from my traditional supermarket. I could buy Kroger groceries through Instacart. I can also buy Costco stuff through Instacart. And I think right now it's really hard to figure out how the court is going to deal with it. I think it's really going to have a big impact on what's known as the geographic market. And we could talk about that if you want, because I think what the e-commerce, the Instacart type services do is they will expand the geographic market, which means that you will have more competitors within a particular geography.
So one of the other things that Balto points out is just the enormous profits that have been recorded, over the last few years. And we all know that a big reason for those profits is inflation. Do you think that have any kind of play in this merger being allowed to go forward or not?
I think it will attract headlines that may play out in the political arena. But when you get there in court, the court's going to be looking at the evidence that's there, and despite the dollar amount of the profits, food and grocery is still a traditionally fairly thin margin business. If you ranked U.S. companies by revenues, by sales, you'd find a lot of retailers are in the top 5 or 10. But if you rank them by profits profits, you're going to find that they're not in the top 10 anymore. They're closer to the middle of the pack, the 50th to 100th in terms of profits, because those profit margins are so small. And that's what's curious to me, is that if you look at Federal Trade Commission Chair Lina Khan's own writing, I think she wrote in 2017 about different parts about merger analysis, and she talked about supermarkets, and she said that one of the reasons, according to her analysis, one of the reasons why you had such a merger wave of supermarkets in the late 1990s was because of the growth of these club stores, warehouse clubs, that were imposing this competitive pressure. And the only way, or one of the ways, that these supermarkets could compete was by combining. And so to me, it's really interesting that you have the FTC's own chair at one point writing that these warehouse clubs do impose competitive pressure on supermarkets.
There's also states attorney generals are threatening to bring this merger to court. Do they have any? FTC is obviously they are the big people. They're the big guy there. Do states threatening to take the merger to court carry any kind of weight?
I think it does, because they can also file their own suits. I'm not a lawyer, so I'm not exactly sure what the whole process is. But there have been mergers that have fallen apart based upon pressure from the states. My understanding was that the Cisco U.S. Foods merger, which is a wholesaler merger, fell apart in part because of pressure from the states as well as the FTC.
Okay. So what's the timeline here, do you think? They want to get this merger approved by the early part of 2024. However, if the FTC is going to challenge this in court, you have, other states willing to challenge in court. How long do you think this can drag out?
Well, it could drag out for a while. There's been quite a bit of reporting. I think Supermarket News reported too that the FTC has indicated that if they do challenge this merger, it probably won't happen until sometime next year, early next year.
Right.
And that's just firing off the starting pistol, because then you have a lot that's going to be going on after that. They've already dug up a lot of information because of the whole merger process where you have to submit information to the FTC. But if it does go to some sort of trial, there will be some sort of discovery. There may be depositions, and they'll be scheduling out the trial itself. The trial could be a couple weeks long. Then, the judge could take his or her time writing the decision. And then whatever that decision is, it could be appealed. And so, you could be looking at anywhere from, if things were fast tracked, right, it could happen within like the first half of next year, to it could be dragged out for a few years.
So Albertsons, Kroger, they continue to reassure everyone, it's not going to result in a rise in prices. We're not going to cut jobs. Based on your knowledge of mergers in the past, do you think that Albertsons and Kroger are on the up and up here, and they're going to do their best to avoid the loss of jobs and rising food costs because of this merger?
Well, I think that I can't second guess what they're going to do. I think that they have a keen interest in staying in business, staying profitable, and pricing is part of it. And when I say pricing, I don't mean necessarily raising prices. It means that they still have to price competitively, because again, they are facing enormous pricing pressures. One reason why people shop at Costco is because they realize they can get a better deal. If you can buy a whole bunch of paper towels and store them in your garage or your basement, buy them cheaper at Costco, then you're going to do that. So if Kroger Albertsons raise the price on paper towels to try to squeeze more out of consumers, those consumers can squeeze back, right? Because they can always go to Amazon or Costco or somewhere else. You've got, I think you also have pressure from Trader Joe's. In some places, you also have pressure from ethnic markets. Some are the mom and pop stores that most people think when they think of ethnic markets, but there's some that are really growing. You've got H Mart, which is Korean. Out here in Portland, we have one called Wajimaya, which is Japanese, but also sells Asian food. You walk in those are huge stores, and so you have that pressure too. And what's interesting is if you go to a place online to something like Instacart and you look for your shopping options, you'll see that your options you have include not just the Kroger, the Safeway, the Albertsons, but they could include Costco, they could include Whole Foods, some of the ethnic stores. In my area, US Foods has their own retail operation. I can buy food from a US Foods on Instacart. So there's a lot of opportunities for competition. And I think it's not so easy that you could just say, we've merged, we're going to go raise prices. On the employment side, you've got that both Kroger and Albertsons are unionized by the UCFW. And so that union power is going to be any sort of countervailing force against any attempt to try to squeeze employees. And my understanding is that CNS has made a commitment to to stay unionized. And these are all agreements that can be put in if there is some sort of settlement where the FTC says, look, if you do the spinoff and do this stuff, they could put a lot of strings on that settlement agreement. And making a commitment that CNS stays unionized could be one of those commitments.
Eric Fruits, he's a co-author of Food Retail Competition, Antitrust Law, and the Kroger Albertsons Merger. Thank you very much, Eric, for joining us today.
Oh, my pleasure.